You are looking at the possible end of an era. Not because the United States suddenly became weak, not because one missile changes everything overnight, and not because Iran has already fired anything at an American carrier. It is bigger than that. If recent reporting is correct, Iran is nearing a deal to acquire Chinese CM-302 supersonic anti-ship missiles, a weapon built for one purpose, to make massive naval power hesitate at the edge of a narrow sea. And that matters because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another body of water. It is one of the most critical energy arteries on the planet. More than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade and roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption moved through that choke point in 2024 and early 2025. At the same time, global military spending hit a record $72 trillion in 2024, with the United States alone spending $997 billion. So think about what that really means. The most expensive military machine ever assembled is concentrating some of its most visible power near one of the narrowest and most economically sensitive waterways on Earth, while a regional rival may be adding a fast, low-flying missile designed to punish exactly that kind of concentration. That is not a random event. That is a pattern. And once you see the pattern, the story changes completely. This stops being a headline about Iran. It becomes a warning about how empires lose freedom of action long before they lose a war. Because history shows the same sequence again and again. First, a dominant power builds a system around visible instruments of control: capital ships, carrier groups, forward bases, trade routes, public promises. It turns power into something the world can see. Then, a weaker rival studies that system and realizes something crucial. It does not need to destroy the empire everywhere. It only needs to make the empire nervous somewhere. So instead of matching power ship for ship, it builds a denial web: missiles, mines, drones, submarines, coastal launchers, fast attack craft, proxy pressure, intelligence networks. The goal is not glory, the goal is friction. Then comes the crisis, a confrontation, a deadline, a threatened strike, a regional war scare. Suddenly, the expensive platform must move inside a zone shaped by cheap, fast, hard-to-intercept weapons. Now the question is no longer whether the stronger power is stronger. Of course it is. The question is whether it is willing to risk its most prestigious assets inside the kill zone. And that is where the real shift happens, because the final stage is not always destruction. Often, it is behavioral change. The fleet stands farther back. The escorts multiply, the defensive burden rises, the tempo slows, the cost of every move increases. The symbol of dominance remains afloat, but its freedom shrinks. That is how denial beats projection. Not by sinking every ship, by rewriting the map those ships can safely use. And before we get to Iran, history needs to do the talking. In 1941, Britain still thought like an empire that could stabilize a region by sending major warships into it. That was the logic behind Force Azid. Send modern capital ships east, show the flag. Deter Japan, protect the route. Preserve the illusion that presence itself would hold the system together. But Japan had already moved to the next layer of war. It did not need to beat Britain in a grand fleet showdown. It built a denial solution around land-based naval aviation, reconnaissance, and concentrated strike. In other words, Britain was still thinking in the language of battleships. Japan was already thinking in the language of vulnerability. Then came the collision. In December 1941, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse sailed without effective fighter cover to intercept Japanese invasion forces. They were found. They were attacked from the air, and on December 10th, both were sunk in the South China Sea. Not in a glorious duel, not in the kind of encounter the old imperial model had imagined. They were simply exposed to a newer system. That is the point. The disaster was not just the loss of 2 ships. It was the public collapse of an assumption. Britain learned that the expensive platform had become conditional. It could no longer operate on prestige alone. It now required a much wider protective ecosystem. The empire still had ships, but the geometry of confidence had been broken. Now jump to 1967. After the Six-Day War, Israel possessed local momentum and confidence. Its destroyer Islet operated in an environment where a conventional surface combatant still seemed like a natural instrument of maritime presence. Bigger ship, better crew, stronger side, familiar logic. Then Egypt introduced the break in the pattern. Not a bigger ship, a cheaper kill chain. Egyptian Comor-class missile boats armed with Soviet Styx missiles created something new, a way for a much smaller platform to threaten a much larger one from outside the old comfort zone. That mattered because it compressed the gap between cheapness and lethality. On October 21st, 1967, that theory became real. Egyptian missile boats fired on Eilat near Port Said. The destroyer was sunk. Dozens were killed. And navies around the world suddenly understood that guided anti-ship missiles had changed the rules. A visible warship could now be cut down by a much smaller attacker carrying the right electronics and the right weapon. Again, the lesson was not about nationality. It was about structure. A platform built for presence had collided with a system built for denial. Then came the Falklands in 1982. Britain sent a task force across enormous distance to reverse Argentina's seizure of the islands. That was projection in its pure form. Concentrated naval power, long supply lines, high-value units, political pressure, and the belief that superior quality would restore order. Argentina did not need to win command of the sea. It needed a puncture. And it found one through a limited but potent denial toolset, Super Etendard aircraft exocet missiles, reconnaissance, timing, and the ability to exploit short reaction windows. On May 4th, HMS Sheffield was hit by an exocet. Later, Atlantic Conveyor was also lost to exocet attack. Britain still won the war, and that is exactly why this case matters so much. Because even victory did not erase the pattern. The stronger Navy was still forced to adapt. It changed spacing, it changed awareness, it changed defensive posture, it respected the missile. And the moment a stronger fleet is forced to fight differently because of a cheaper denial weapon, the pattern has already worked. So now we come back to the present, and this is where the subject becomes urgent. According to Reuters, Iran is nearing a deal to buy Chinese CM-302 anti-ship missiles, with no public delivery date yet agreed. According to AP, the United States is assembling its largest force of warships and aircraft in the Middle East in decades, including 2 carrier strike groups. And according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Hormuz remains a choke point through which more than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade and about 1/5 of global oil and petroleum product consumption passed in 2024 and early 2025. Put those 3 facts together. Potential missile enhancement, massive American naval concentration, a narrow global energy choke point. That is the equation. And once you reduce it to the equation, the pattern becomes almost mechanical. Stage 1 is already visible. The United States still organizes a huge share of its coercive power around carriers and the wider architecture that protects them. That architecture is real power. It is not theater. But it is also highly visible, highly expensive, and politically difficult to risk. A carrier is not just a weapon. It is a national statement. That makes it formidable. It also makes it psychologically rigid. A missile designer understands something politicians hate to admit. Symbols are easier to manipulate than machines. You do not need to sink the symbol to weaken it. You only need to make its owners hesitate. That brings us to stage 2. Iran has spent years building precisely the kind of layered denial ecosystem weaker maritime actors build when they cannot dominate the open ocean. Missiles, drones, fast attack concepts, proxy pressure, coastal launchers, exercises around Hormuz. Reuters reported in late 2025 and early 2026 on Iranian drills involving ballistic and cruise missiles against simulated targets in the Gulf region. That means the denial mindset is not theoretical. It is already embedded in the way Iran prepares for confrontation. Now add the possible Chinese missile deal. This matters because the CM-302 is not just another headline weapon. In strategic terms, it is a multiplier. A fast, low-flying anti-ship missile in the hands of a coastal power sitting beside Hormuz does not need to guarantee a kill to change American behavior. It only needs to be credible enough to force planners to widen risk calculations. And here is the mistake casual viewers make. They ask whether one missile can sink one carrier. That is the wrong question. The right question is whether a denser threat environment can push carriers farther from shore, force more escorts into defensive roles, consume interceptors, complicate sortie generation, slow operational tempo, and inject political caution into every decision. If the answer is yes, then the denial system is already succeeding before the first major battle even begins. That is the deeper danger here. Because strategy reacts to trajectories, not only inventories. The moment credible reporting says a deal is nearing completion, military planners must start preparing for eventual fielding, training, dispersal, decoys, integration, and surprise. The weapon begins shaping behavior before it arrives. That is how modern pressure works. Uncertainty is not a weakness in the denial model. Uncertainty is part of the weapon. Now go one layer deeper. A carrier strike group is never just one ship. It is a moving ecosystem of escorts, aircraft, surveillance, logistics, defensive coordination, and political calculation. So every new anti-ship threat does not merely threaten the deck of a carrier. It taxes the entire system wrapped around it. More protection, more spacing, more caution, more support demands, more things to defend. And the setting makes this worse. Hormuz is not open ocean. It is compressed geography, commercial shipping, military signaling, energy flows, and retaliatory timelines all overlap there. The narrower the space, the more leverage a denial weapon can create. And because only a limited amount of regional pipeline capacity can bypass Hormuz during a disruption, even temporary military friction there can create market shock far beyond the battlefield. So this is never just a naval story. It is a naval story, an energy story, a market story, an insurance story, and a credibility story at the same time. That is what makes it dangerous. Now consider the strategic psychology. If the United States relies primarily on air and naval power in this crisis, rather than a large ground package, then the very instruments it is leaning on most heavily are the instruments a denial web is designed to complicate. Carriers, escorts, strike aircraft, tankers, regional bases, maritime logistics, and finite defensive munitions all become part of the same pressure equation. So when people say, America still has overwhelming power, they are not wrong. They are just answering the wrong question. The question is not whether America is powerful. The question is whether power can move freely inside a narrowing envelope of acceptable risk. That is a very different question. And once you understand that, stage 4 becomes visible. No, it does not mean an American carrier must be sunk tomorrow. No, it does not mean the U. S. Navy suddenly becomes obsolete. No, it does not mean Iran becomes stronger overall than the United States. It means freedom of action contracts. The carrier may stand farther back. The escort burden may rise. The defensive load may thicken. The timing of strikes may become more cautious. The cost of operating near the choke point may rise faster than the public realizes. And that is exactly how older forms of dominance begin to erode. Not in one cinematic moment, in a series of prudent adjustments. That is why the most important battlefield effect here may be invisible to the casual observer. It may show up not as a burning deck, but as greater standoff distance, denser protection, more complicated strike packages, more dependence on regional access, and more fear of escalation around shipping. That still counts as strategic success for the denial side, because the mission of the denial side is not necessarily to win total command. It is to make command too expensive to exercise cleanly. This is also why China benefits from the pattern even without direct involvement in a shooting war. If Chinese origin missiles force the U.S. Navy to spend more attention, more escorts, more logistics, and more caution in the Gulf, then Beijing has helped stretch American operating freedom at another strategic pressure point. The value is not only in the missile itself, the value is in the added friction. That is systems competition. And history keeps laughing at one comforting phrase. This time is different. Britain believed its capital ships would stabilize Asia until aircraft proved otherwise. Conventional navies believed bigger surface combatants were naturally safer until ILOT proved otherwise. Britain won the Falklands, but still had to bow to the logic of the Exocet. Every era thinks its flagship has escaped the pattern. None of them do. Yes, technology improves. Yes, defenses improve. Yes, sensors improve. But the denial web evolves too, and in a choke point, geography helps the side trying to impose hesitation. That is why military spending alone solves nothing. Record spending does not abolish vulnerability. It often multiplies it, because rising budgets fund both projection and denial. The bigger question is never who spends more in absolute terms. The bigger question is who spends in a way that changes the other side's behavior. That is leverage. So, if you want to understand whether the pattern is active, stop looking only for destruction. Watch behavior. Watch how far carriers stay from the tightest threat rings. Watch how many escorts are devoted to protection. Watch how much depends on tankers, interceptors, surveillance, and regional basing. Watch how quickly shipping risk becomes part of every serious discussion. Watch whether the most powerful navy in the world is still acting with confidence or with caution. That is where the truth reveals itself. And the truth is this. If Iran really does move closer to fielding Chinese CM-302 missiles, then America's carriers do not need to become helpless to become vulnerable. They only need to become more constrained, more careful, more expensive to use, more politically difficult to risk. That is enough to change the region, enough to change deterrence, enough to change market expectations, enough to change how a crisis unfolds. So do not reduce this to a simple question of whether one missile can kill one carrier. The real issue is whether the age of unquestioned carrier proximity and choke point warfare is being pushed into retreat by faster, cheaper, more flexible denial systems. Because if that answer is yes, then we are not watching a procurement story. We are watching the next stage of a historical law. The law that says great powers build visible machines of control, rivals build cheaper machines of hesitation, and sooner or later, a crisis arrives to reveal which one actually shapes behavior. That is the law Britain met in 1941. That is the law ILOT met in 1967. That is the law Sheffield met in 1982. And that may be the law American carriers are now approaching off Iran. Not the end of American power, something more subtle. The end of easy access. And once easy access ends, strategy changes, markets react, alliances tense up, and every move inside the choke point becomes more dangerous than it looked on paper. That is why this matters. That is why this is urgent. And that is why this is bigger than one missile deal. If you want to understand what happens next, then do not just study the weapon. Study the machine it is designed to disrupt. Because the next phase is not simply about what Iran can fire. It is about how the world's strongest navy behaves when the old symbols of dominance are still alive, still feared, still massive, but no longer free. And that is the moment every empire tells itself will never come. Right before it does,